The sword ruled medieval warfare. Knights trained with swords from childhood. Blacksmiths perfected sword making for centuries. The blade was symbol, status, and supreme weapon. Then came the poleaxe, and suddenly swords became expensive decorations carried by men who knew they'd fight with something else. The poleaxe didn't just compete with swords, it made them obsolete for armored combat. Within decades of its refinement in the 14th century, every serious knight carried a poleaxe as their primary battlefield weapon. The sword that had dominated warfare for a millennium became a backup tool, kept for prestige and unarmored opponents. This wasn't gradual evolution. This was rapid replacement once knights realized a simple truth. Against armor, swords were nearly useless, and poleaxes solved every problem armor created. The weapon that ended sword fighting wasn't exotic or complicated, it was 6 feet of wood with the perfect combination of tools mounted on top. The poleaxe emerged from practical battlefield failure. Knights in the 13th and early 14th centuries fought primarily with swords. They trained their entire lives in swordsmanship. The weapon was deeply connected to knightly identity. Ceremonies, oaths, symbols all featured swords. Then plate armor improved. By the 1300s, quality plate armor deflected sword cuts almost completely. Knights would slash at each other with expensive swords, see the blade bounce off armor, and accomplish nothing. The weapon they'd spent years mastering was failing against opponents in good armor. The wrestling problem became obvious. Armored knights would drop their useless swords and grapple, trying to wrestle opponents down to stab them with daggers through armor gaps. The entire battlefield descended into armored wrestling matches. It was effective but brutally exhausting and slow. Existing polearms were too specialized. Spears thrust well but couldn't strike powerfully. Axes cut but couldn't thrust effectively. Hammers crushed but lacked reach versatility. Knights needed something that combined multiple capabilities in one weapon. The battlefield experiences drove innovation. Knights returning from campaigns would work with armorers and weaponsmiths, describing exactly what they needed. The feedback loop between actual combat and weapon design accelerated through the 1300s. Every modification was tested in real fights, tournaments, judicial duels, and actual warfare. The development wasn't uniform. Different regions produced variations. Italian poleaxes had longer spikes. German versions featured more elaborate hammer designs. English poleaxes often had simpler, more robust construction. But all converged on the same basic formula: hammer, blade, spike, optimal shaft length. The poleaxe emerged from this need, practical battlefield response to armor making swords obsolete. What started as modified tools became refined into the ultimate knightly weapon. The design was deceptively simple but brutally optimized. A hardwood shaft, typically 6 feet long, topped with a multifaceted head that could kill in 3 different ways. One side featured a hammer face, typically a flat or slightly convex steel surface. This wasn't for dramatic crushing, it delivered focused impact that transferred force through armor. The hammer face would strike a helmet and transfer enough energy through the metal to cause concussion, skull fracture, or brain trauma without penetrating. The armor stayed intact. The person inside died from kinetic energy transfer. The metallurgy mattered critically. The hammer face had to be hard enough to avoid deforming on impact, but not so hard it became brittle and shattered. Medieval smiths developed specific tempering techniques for poleaxe heads, often differential hardening where the hammer face was hardest, the spike slightly softer for penetration without breaking, and the mounting socket toughest to absorb shock. The opposite side carried an axe blade, but not for chopping wood. The blade was carefully shaped to hook behind joints and armor edges. It could catch the back of a knee, pull, and sever tendons through the weak male backing at articulation points. Could hook a helmet and jerk a knight off balance. Could strike into armor gaps with concentrated force swords couldn't deliver. The blade geometry was specific. Too wide and it wouldn't penetrate gaps. Too narrow and it lacked structural strength. The curve had to catch armor edges without glancing off. Medieval weaponsmiths refined these angles through generations of trial and error, producing blades that hooked reliably on armor features. The top spike was murder engineered. A narrow steel point, heavily reinforced, designed specifically to fit through helmet eye slits and breathing holes. When a knight went down, the spike finished them, driven through visor openings directly into the brain. The coup de grace weapon built into the primary tool. The spike's cross-section varied by design. Some were diamond-shaped for maximum penetration. Others were square for structural strength. The best combined both, diamond tip transitioning to square base. The reinforcement often included a rondelle guard just below the spike to prevent over-penetration that could wedge the weapon in a skull. The shaft length was critical. 6 feet gave reach advantage over swords without becoming unwieldy in close combat. Knights could strike from outside sword range, then close for grappling while using the poleaxe shaft to lever and control opponents. The shaft material mattered enormously. Ash was preferred, strong, flexible enough to absorb impact shock without splintering, dense enough to add momentum to strikes. Some wealthy knights used steel-reinforced shafts or had metal strips running the length to prevent cutting. The grip areas were often wrapped in leather or cord for better purchase. The balance point was engineered carefully. A well-made poleaxe balanced at roughly 1/3 of the shaft length from the head. This allowed powerful strikes while maintaining control. Poor balance made the weapon clumsy, too head-heavy, and it was exhausting to wield, too light in the head, and strikes lacked power. The weapon combined blunt trauma, cutting capability, and armor-piercing thrust in one tool that could be wielded with leverage swords couldn't match. Every component solved a specific problem armor created. The poleaxe transformed knightly combat from swordsmanship to systematic dismantling. Technique shifted completely. The skills that made great swordsmen were different from what made effective poleaxe fighters. The primary attack pattern targeted specific anatomy. Hammer strikes aimed for the head. Helmets were strong, but heads inside were vulnerable to concussive force. Knights trained to deliver precise hammer blows to the temple, back of head or face. The goal wasn't denting armor, it was scrambling the brain through kinetic transfer. The striking mechanics used the entire body. Knights learned to generate power from legs and hips, transmitting it through the shaft to the hammer face. The technique was similar to modern baseball batting, rotational power rather than arm strength. A properly executed hammer strike could deliver hundreds of pounds of force to a focused point. The axe side focused on mobility killing. Hook the back of the knee and pull. The blade caught armor edges, bit through mail backing, severed the tendons that let knights stand. A hamstrung knight fell. Falling in armor meant death. The axe side wasn't about cutting opponents, it was about dropping them. The hooking became central technique. Knights learned to catch opponents' weapons with the axe blade, lever them aside, create openings, use the hook to grab armor edges and control opponents' body position. The poleaxe became a tool for manipulating where enemies could move and what they could defend. The spike finished everything. Once an opponent was down, injured, or immobilized, the spike ended them. Drive it through eye slit, force it into throat gaps, pierce through the thinner armor at armpits. The spike was execution tool for opponents who were helpless but not yet dead. The execution technique was taught methodically. Place your foot on the fallen opponent's chest for leverage. Position the spike point at the eye slit. Drive downward with your body weight and both hands. The systematic nature of killing helpless opponents was acknowledged and trained. Medieval combat included murdering defeated enemies as standard practice. The shaft became weapon itself. Knights would grip the poleaxe at different points for different ranges. High grip for maximum reach, low grip for close combat control, middle grip for balanced fighting. The shaft could block, could strike like a staff, could lever opponents off balance. The grip changes were trained sequences. Start in long grip for initial engagement. Transition to middle grip as distance closes. Switch to short grip for grappling and murder stroke techniques. The fluidity of grip changes separated experts from novices. Good poleaxe fighters could adjust grip mid-exchange without conscious thought. The versatility meant one weapon for all ranges and situations. Swords required switching to daggers in close combat, to spears at range, to hammers for armoured opponents. The poleaxe did everything competently with techniques that could transition smoothly between modes. Training shifted from sword forms to poleaxe combinations that exploited armour vulnerabilities systematically. The adoption happened faster than any previous weapon change. By the mid-1400s, the poleaxe had become the primary knightly battlefield weapon across Europe. The speed of replacement showed how dramatically superior it was. Tournament combat switched to poleaxes. Judicial duels, formal fights to settle legal disputes, increasingly specified poleaxe combat. These were the most serious, witnessed, and documented fights. Knights chose poleaxes because they worked better than swords against armoured opponents. The judicial combat records are revealing. German Fechtbücher, fight books from the 1400s, showed detailed poleaxe techniques for judicial duels. These weren't battlefield tactics, but refined single combat methods. The fact that legal duels to the death used poleaxes over swords showed which weapon knights trusted with their lives. Training manuals documented the shift. Medieval fighting treatises from the 1400s showed detailed poleaxe techniques. The manuscripts illustrated complex sequences: hammer to head, hook the leg, drive spike through visor. The systematic approach was taught, refined, and spread through knight culture. The battlefield dominance was absolute. Chronicles from mid-1400s battles describe knights fighting primarily with poleaxes. Swords were kept as sidearms and status symbols. The actual killing was done with a weapon that worked. The economics reinforced adoption. A quality poleaxe cost a fraction of a masterwork sword. Knights could afford multiple poleaxes. If one broke, grab another. Swords were investments kept safe. Poleaxes were expendable tools used hard and replaced. The social resistance was minimal. Knights accepted the change because survival mattered more than tradition. The men who clung to swords as primary weapons died to men who'd embraced poleaxes. Natural selection favored adaptation. By 1450, asking a knight to fight in armor with only a sword was like asking a modern soldier to fight with only a pistol. Technically possible, tactically stupid. The sword had become the backup weapon. The poleaxe's dominance lasted until armor itself became obsolete. The weapon and armor that created it fell together. The sword's relegation happened definitively in the 15th century. The weapon that had defined knightly combat became a sidearm and symbol rather than a primary battlefield tool. The ceremonies kept swords central. Knights were still dubbed with swords. Oaths were still sworn on swords. The symbolic importance remained because tradition moved slower than tactics. But on actual battlefields, the men carrying swords prominently were either inexperienced or making statements about wealth rather than combat readiness. The dueling culture preserved swordsmanship. Unarmored duels, civilian self-defense, and judicial combats where armor wasn't worn kept sword technique alive. The sword remained supreme weapon for fighting unarmored opponents. But armoured battlefield combat, the core of knightly warfare, had moved on. The quality changed purpose. Master swordsmiths continued making exceptional swords, but increasingly as art pieces and status markers. The craftsmanship was appreciated aesthetically more than tactically. A beautifully made sword showed wealth and taste. A practical poleaxe showed you understood actual combat. The training time shifted. Young knights still learned swordsmanship, but the intensive training moved to poleaxe work. Sword skills were foundation and backup. Poleaxe technique was advanced curriculum and battlefield priority. The literary tradition obscured the reality. Medieval romances and later retellings featured sword combat because swords were dramatic and symbolic. The practical battlefield dominance of poleaxes didn't make good stories. Literature preserved the sword's reputation, while battlefield reality had moved to more effective tools. By the time firearms began making armor obsolete in the early 1500s, the sword had been secondary battlefield weapon for nearly a century. The poleaxe ended sword fighting's dominance long before guns ended knighthood. The poleaxe disappeared with the armor it was designed to defeat. As plate armor became less common through the 1500s, the specialized anti-armor weapon lost relevance. Polearms evolved into pikes and halberds, formations, weapons for infantry rather than knightly tools. The sword reclaimed dominance in civilian contexts. Unarmored sword fighting, dueling, self-defense, civilian combat kept swordsmanship alive and eventually became the romanticized image. The period when knights primarily used poleaxes got forgotten in favor of older sword-centric traditions and later civilian fencing. The historical record is clear but overlooked. Medieval manuscripts, tournament regulations, battlefield chronicles, and preserved weapons all show poleaxe dominance in the 1400s. Modern people imagine knights fighting primarily with swords because that's what fiction emphasizes. The documentary evidence tells a different story. The lesson is about practical adaptation. Knights abandoned centuries of sword tradition when better tools emerged. The emotional attachment to swords and swords' continued symbolic importance didn't prevent tactical evolution. Warriors chose weapons that worked over weapons that looked noble. The poleaxe represents the moment medieval combat became completely technical. The Romantic era of sword fighting gave way to pragmatic anti-armor warfare. The weapon that ended sword fighting was less elegant, less symbolic, and far more effective at the specific problem of killing armored men. The sword's reign over medieval warfare ended not with firearms but with a 6-foot wooden shaft topped with hammer, blade, and spike, the weapon that solved armor and made a millennium of sword technique obsolete in decades.